Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the London Lyceum. I'm Jordan Steffaniak, one of your hosts. And here on the London Lyceum, we're all about serious thinking for a serious church. And we try to create or cultivate an intellectual culture of things like charity, curiosity, critical thinking, and cheerful confessionalism. I want to thank you for tuning in to one of our roundtable events. These are a lot of fun where we gather together four different scholars with different expertise, different views on things to just sort of chat about a topic. And today we're going to be talking about free choice and Reformed theology. This is going to be very unique. So some of our stuff, like we've done like political theology sort of stuff where everybody like presents their own particular view. But we've also done some more just let's have a dialogue and discussion about it. So we had one recently on the theological interpretation of scripture. And that was more just like, let's have a dialogue about the state of this interpretive paradigm and some challenges and some what it may look like in the future. And today, again, this is going to be more of a discussion. So we have some historians with us, we have some philosophers with us, and we have a little bit of both with us. So this should be a lot of fun. So I'll go ahead and introduce everybody. We've got Michael, who is a pastor, but he's also, he's well-trained philosopher. You went to St. Andrews, right?
Aberdeen, University of
Aberdeen. Okay, so they're all the same to me over there, up there in Scotland. Interchangeable in my mind. I know that's probably heresy to everybody who's actually over there, but I'll just pretend play dumb there. We also have Marco Barone with us. For some reason, his screen is frozen, but he'll be back in a minute, I'm sure. We have Taylor Cyr, and who's a philosopher, and then we have Layne Hancock, who is a little bit of everything, historian, philosopher, and jack of all trades, which is what I would expect from everybody who is at the University of Notre Dame. So everybody who's joining in, I just want to remind you guys who are watching live right now, you are welcome to comment, to put anything in the chat as you want. We all see all of those. So if you have questions, you have thoughts, you have ideas, feel free to drop them there and we will include them as we go. Initially, everybody's going to get some opportunity just to sort of like sketch a little bit of the lay of the land, to just say, here's the general idea of the views on offer in Reformed theology on free choice. Some better, some worse. And we're going to kind of walk through. So a little bit, some are going to be more talking about more of the history. Some are going to be talking more of the contemporary landscape. And from there, we'll have a discussion and just see, is what analytic theology or analytic philosophy is doing with the literature or the terms now, is that even useful? Is that anachronistic? What is the best nomenclature to really use and to apply to some of the stuff that's in the older debates, and et cetera? So it should be a lot of fun. What should we leave behind? What should we keep? Yeah, so this is gonna be great. So I'll start with Michael, and then we'll jump around. So I'm gonna go ahead and give him the floor here. So in the cool little layout, so that everybody knows that he's rocking. So I'll let him take it away from here, and I'll just hang out and watch and listen. All right, Michael,
Great.
It's all you.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, and thanks to all the others here. It's an honor to be with you. Basically, what I thought I would do was give a little bit of an overview of a contemporary debate on this issue in Reformed theology, then talk about some terminology, then give two brief arguments, simple arguments, for why we ought to think of the Reformed Orthodox as compatibilists and soft determinists. And then I'd like to outline at the end a brief sketch of what the Reformed Orthodox taught basically about free choice. So let me start by saying and mentioning, as I did already, that there's been a lively debate over the past 10, maybe 15 years in the Reformed community as to whether or not Reformed theology is properly thought of as determinist and or compatibilist. There are two sides roughly of the debate. On one side, you have guys like Richard Muller and what is known as the Utrecht School. Those are scholars that consist of men like Willem van Asselt and J. Martin Bach and a number of others. These scholars believe that Reformed theology cannot properly be conceived of as compatibilist or determinist. On the other side, you have scholars such as Paul Helm, and I guess if you want to consider me a scholar, me, who thinks that they are compatibilists and they are determinists. So we believe that when those terms are properly understood, that is understood in terms of the way philosophers of free will and moral responsibility define them, we believe that it pretty clearly shows that they were in fact compatibilists and determinists and soft determinists. So what I want to do is I want to lay out for you a proposal that is designed to bring unity amongst both camps. I think that when we define these terms properly and I lay out a couple arguments, I think it becomes reasonable to both sides to consider the Reformed Orthodox as compatibilists and determinists. So let me start out by giving some terminology. First off, what is compatibilism? Compatibilism is basically just the idea that determinism and free will are logically compatible. So you can say there's at least one possible world where determinism is true and an agent has free will. Now, note here that compatibilism is not the thesis that determinism is true. It's the thesis that determinism and free will are compatible. Next, determinism. What do we mean by determinism? A lot of people get scared by this term. They think of things that it really isn't. But determinism really is just a type of necessity. It's a type of hypothetical necessity or conditional necessity. The Reformed Orthodox called this the necessity of the consequence. And the basic idea is this: given certain antecedent conditions, the consequent follows necessarily. So for example, necessarily, if God decrees that Adam fall, then Adam will fall. So this is not an absolute necessity. It's a conditional or a hypothetical necessity. And what that means that if the antecedent were different, then the consequent would be different. So basically, when we think of determinism, just think of hypothetical necessity. Soft determinism is the thesis that free will and determinism are logically compatible. That is the compatibilist thesis there. And that determinism is true. Determinism understood as hypothetical necessity. So now I'm going to give a couple arguments. The first argument is a brief argument. It's not intended to be rigorous. It's just intended to be very simple, just to try to be as clear as possible. An argument for why we ought to think of the Reformed Orthodox as compatibilists, and then one after that as to why we ought to think of them as soft determinists. So premise one, compatibilism is the idea that determinism, understood as hypothetical necessity, is compatible with free choice or free will. Premise two, the Reformed Orthodox taught that hypothetical necessity is compatible with free choice or free will. Conclusion, the Reformed Orthodox were compatibilists. Now here's an argument for soft determinism. Premise one, soft determinism is the idea that compatibilism is true and determinism, understood as hypothetical necessity, is true in the actual world. Premise two, the Reformed Orthodox taught that compatibilism is true. Premise three, the Reformed Orthodox taught that determinism, understood as hypothetical necessity, is true in the actual world. We see this all over the place when they make the claim that God has decreed whatsoever comes to pass. Conclusion, the Reformed Orthodox taught soft determinism. Now, in order to substantiate the truth of the premises in these two arguments above, one needs to provide texts from the Reformed Orthodox demonstrating that they taught three things. One, hypothetical necessity, or what philosophers call determinism. Two, that hypothetical necessity is compatible with free choice or free will. And three, that the Reformed Orthodox taught that hypothetical necessity is true in the actual world. Now, all parties in the debate, whether it be the Utrecht School or Richard Muller or Paul Helm or myself, agree that they in fact did teach these three principles or these three ideas. So I'm obviously going to provide quotations later on if you want me to do that. I'm trying to just be brief here. But this then provides us with an interesting proposal that we could all agree upon, that namely the Reformed Orthodox are in fact compatibilists and soft determinists along the lines of these terms as they have been defined, as they are standardly used within the realm of the philosophy of free will and moral responsibility. And so therefore, I think that the debate ought to shift from the question, are the Reformed Orthodox compatibilists, to the question, what kind of compatibilists are the Reformed Orthodox? Okay, so now that said, I want to give a very brief outline of what the Reformed Orthodox thought of as free choice. Now, the Reformed Orthodox held to what's known as faculty psychology. And the relevant faculties here are the faculty of the intellect and the faculty of the will. And there's a diversity within the Reformed Orthodox camp as to how these relate. Some were more intellectualistic, some were more voluntaristic, and some were more of taught that it was more of a mixed kind of relationship between the two. But the Reformed Orthodox clearly believed in free choice. And it's important to point out also that compatibilists believe in free choice as well, once it is defined properly. So it all comes down to how we articulate it. The Reformed Orthodox held that the faculty of the will had what is called the liberty of contradiction and the liberty of contrariety. The liberty of contradiction is the idea that they have the freedom to choose A or not A. That is, I can choose to have a martini or I can choose to not have a martini. That's the liberty of contradiction. The liberty of contrariety is the idea that they have freedom to choose A or B or C or D or so on. That is, I have the ability to choose to eat an apple or to eat a pear or to eat a banana. Now, the Reformed Orthodox taught that this is free choice, or what Muller calls alternativity, and that this is part of the essential structure of the human will. That is, the will possesses this kind of free choice in all of its states, whether fallen, or whether created, whether fallen, whether regenerated or glorified. And this means that there is a fundamental indifference in the will. But this indifference is of a different kind than what we find in the Jesuits or the Remonstrants, or in what today is called the principle of alternative possibilities, as some forms of libertarianism hold. If we were to define the principle of alternative possibilities as briefly as we can, it would say something like this: holding fixed all that is inside the agent and outside the agent, that is, all of our mental states, our psychological states, and everything that's outside of us, the laws of physics, the decrees of God, we hold all of that fixed. The agent or the will could choose A or not A, B or C or D. That is, it has the liberty of contradiction or the liberty of contrariety. Now, the Reformed Orthodox denied free choice or this kind of indifference in the will. They did not hold to this kind. This is what they were actually arguing against. But they did affirm a kind of indifference in the will that they identify with free choice. And in order to see this, we need to make a distinction between what is called the composite sense and the divided sense. The Reformed Orthodox taught that there were certain requisites for action that must be in place in order for an action to take place. For example, a requisite for action would be God's decree, or God's foreknowledge, or the last judgment of the intellect. Now, for simplicity's sake, I will just go with God's decree here. The composite sense says that the will with the requisites for action being in place, the composite sense is the will with the requisites for action being in place. So that is the will thought of in conjunction with the decree of God being in place. The divided sense is the will without the requisites for action being in place. That is, it's considering the will in and of itself apart from the divine decree. Now, with regards to the decree, the composite sense says that the will, that is with the decree in place, does not have this kind of indifference. The divided sense says that the will without the decree in place does have this kind of indifference. So the fundamental indifference that the Reformed Orthodox affirmed was indifference in the will, in the divided sense, without the requisites for action being in place. Now, in relation to God's decree, then, the will can choose to do otherwise. The will cannot choose to do otherwise than what God decreed. But in and of itself, that is, in the divided sense, the will can choose to do other than what God has decreed. Now, one final point here. In the literature, there is a bit of a debate between Helm and Muller as to whether or not there is a sense in which the will can do otherwise also in the composite sense. That is, with the decree in place of the will, on the will. Muller says yes, and Helm basically says that it's kind of a scholastic question. Muller thinks that in the composite sense, there remains what he calls a resident potency to multiple choices. That is, even though God has decreed an agent to do X, nonetheless, the agent retains this resident potency to do not X, A, or B, or C. However, this resident potency is unactualized and it is unactualizable. In this sense, Muller thinks that the agent can do otherwise, even with the requisites for action being in place. And Helm basically thinks that this is an unnecessary scholastic addition. So, given all of that, we can see that if the argument follows, if the argument is good, that properly we should think of the Reformed Orthodox as soft determinists and compatibilists, that the debate ought to shift to what kind of compatibilists the Reformed Orthodox are, and that we have a very brief understanding here that hopefully we'll elaborate on later on as to what free choice was in Reformed Orthodoxy.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. That was great.
Thank
so
you.
I'll shift to Layne to give us a little bit of an intro to some of the ideas and topics that we would like to cover. So I'll let you take it away here for the next 10 or so minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Jordan. And thanks, Taylor, Marco, and Michael for the conversation. I'm looking forward to learning from you all. And I'm also feel very relieved that Michael got a lot of the technical stuff out of the way. So with that in mind, I'll start with a poem. You can and you can't, you shall and you shan't, you will and you won't, and you will be damned if you do, and you will be damned if you don't. This was an anti-Edwardsian jingle invented by the Methodist preacher and satirist Lorenzo Dow in 1814. And it was far more successful in undermining New England Reformed theology in the 19th century than any single book or argument. Dow is ridiculing as contradictory something that Edwards thought was actually Edwards is actually very careful about. That is the topic of modal indexing. That is, the terms necessary, contingent, impossible, could be otherwise, must, can, and cannot are common and widespread terms, but they're also relative, and they need to be clearly fixed to definitions if we're not going to engage in equivocation or if we're not going to be confused about them. By not carefully indexing and defining cannot and could be otherwise, Dow and other opponents found it much easier to run Edwardsianism out of England. And we should be careful not to make the same mistake. And so just to piggyback off of what Michael was doing, Michael was indexing, you might say, the sense in which indifference could be said. So there's two different ways of stating indifference. One is the composite, one is the divided sense. But if you said, if you just saw Turretin or Michael saying the Reformed both affirm indifference, but also deny indifference, and there's no qualification of that, then you would have a contradiction, you'd have problems. This leads to my second point that I want to make at this roundtable on free choice and Reformed theology. It's a bit cheeky, but the point is just to say that much of the debate surrounding free will is not actually about Reformed theology, but actually perfect being theology. On my reading across much of the scholastic tradition, it is not Reformed theories about justification or sanctification or ecclesial reforms or Calvin's irritable personality that generate problems about human freedom and predestination, but instead more Catholic intuitions about divine omniscience, divine causality, divine power, aseity, and more importantly, how to make sense of Scripture. Too often, Reformed accounts on freedom and predestination are banners waved as if monergism and its benefits only redound to our tribe. This might seem well and good until the costs of monergism come due, and the Reformed tribe is left by itself to foot an intellectual bill that could best be paid out by a tradition that spans a millennium, rather than the 200 years or so of scholastic theology we have. And this links up to the larger question of, you might say, like formation or pedagogy or just time investment. You know, what's the relationship of analytic theology, scholastic theology, the Christian tradition for answering these questions? In short, much of what funds objections to Reformed accounts of freedom, I'm saying, are basically perfect being premises. Being aware of this might have improved the quality of recent debates on free choice that Michael just introduced us to. A third point comes close to the second. There is no singular Reformed view on freedom. There is no the definite article Reformed view. There are confessional boundaries and family resemblances, but once we get inside those, history is rich with all sorts of models for making sense of moral responsibility. Most viewers will know about the Reformed scholastics, but within those, and again, Mike already alluded to this, there were those who leaned towards Aquinas, others towards Scotus, and even one or two alchemists to be found. Outside of the schools, especially during the 17th century, there were Reformed Cartesians spinning occasionalist theories of free choice. There were Reformed Lockeans who shied away from metaphysical accounts of this. There were Reformed Leibnizians or rationalists who couldn't shut up about doing metaphysical accounts of free choice. There were also Scottish common sense Reformed and less commonsensical German Reformed Spinozist accounts of free choice. I even once found a Reformed Kantian. Thus, Reformed and free choice can be had in many different ways. And my 2 cents of like what could be worked on and what might be future for future scholars is the plurality of Reformed models of free choice. Imagine most of tonight's center of gravity is going to be within the Reformed schools, but the schools should not be viewed as the last word of the matter because historically they most certainly were not. My fourth and final point kind of takes what Mike already laid out and zooms out a little bit more and says, basically, I'm having to reformulate it. When we come to all these different systems and all these different thinkers, different Reformed figures who are differently dependent on philosophers all over the place, it's a lot safer to ask what each figure thought the conditions for praise and blame were, so conditions for imputability, than like what's their theory of free choice or what's their theory of freedom. So in broad strokes, there are 3 features. One is intelligence as a capacity for deliberation. So God, angels, and humans, not animals and plants, are sufficient to meet that requirement. A proper account of spontaneity, that we are the source of our actions, but with the qualification that we're not the source of our existence and our being. And then the third requirement is a proper account of contingency, a qualified way of being able to do otherwise in the way that Mike was talking about, not being subject to absolute or logical necessity of a particular kind. And this is interestingly a place where Turretin and Leibniz overlap in their conditions for freedom. The reference there is Theodicy, section 288, and the Institutes of Dogmatic Theology 6, 5 through 6. To this, some Reformed add a liberty of indifference, but as Tom Lennon pointed out in a very interesting article, liberty of indifference can be said in 7 different ways. So rather than unpack all 7, I'll just say those are the broadly construed conditions for praise and blame in the early modern period. Intelligence, spontaneity properly understood, a contingency properly understood, and a liberty of indifference as a sort of option, an optional account.
Awesome. Thanks, Layne. And now I'll let Taylor take the floor. Taylor's been with us on quite a few things, so he's definitely the resident expert for the London Lyceum as far as these formats go. So I'll let you roll.
In this conversation, I'll be the outlier, though. I was about to say now for something completely different. Thanks to Michael, Layne, Marco for doing this, and thanks to Jordan for organizing it and hosting it. I was really kind of struck by Layne's point that of the Reformed Orthodox, you can add sort of an adjective qualifier with like almost any early modern philosopher's name. It's a nice plug for my philosophy courses for theologians to take some philosophy too. I guess I'll just say really quickly some of what I see as the kind of basics of the contemporary free will debate in analytic philosophy. And it really is just going to kind of connect up with what Michael and Layne have already said, which maybe sort of point us to thinking that it's kind of helpful for looking back into the Christian tradition to have the terminology, the conceptual tools of contemporary philosophy. When people ask me what I study, when I tell them I study free will, I say, well, there's lots of different things that people can mean by free will. This isn't anything new. It's really tricky to kind of get a handle on the free will debate at any time in history. But one expression that's, I think, instructive and helpful is the sense of something's being up to me, if you would, up to you. If it's under your control in a certain sort of way. That's kind of what people tend to mean by free will, or sometimes free choice. Could talk about freedom of choice and freedom of action. That's a distinction that's sometimes made in the contemporary debate. But the basic idea is just something's being under your control in a certain kind of way. And what that certain kind of way is, it might depend on what you think free will is important for. So most philosophers today think of free will as importantly tied to moral responsibility, or accountability in particular, or to praise and blame, imputability in Layne's term. So what am I to blame for? What am I at fault for? Or what am I praiseworthy for? These are the things that seem like, well, it'd have to be up to me or under my control for me to be on the hook or to praise for what I do. But free will might matter for other things too, for creativity, for rationality or personhood. Sometimes people think for developing virtue, for valuable interpersonal relationships, maybe love depends on free will. So this is why I think it matters whether we have free will, and also matters what we think free will amounts to and what it's really required for. There in the contemporary debate, almost everyone who works on free will is interested in the question of whether free will is compatible or incompatible with determinism. So Michael laid out a really nice definition of determinism in sort of like the broadest way you could use the term determinism. But in contemporary philosophy, a lot of times philosophers will sort of bracket questions about God's omniscience and providence, and will think only about determinism in the context of the physical laws, like the natural laws. And so causal determinism, as it often gets called in the contemporary debate, is what Michael said, but constrained or constricted to just the past and the laws of nature. So think again of the idea of conditional or hypothetical necessity. If causal determinism is true, the idea is, given that the past was this way, say 1,000 years ago, or many more years ago than that, and given that the laws of nature are such, there's only one physically possible future from that point, from here. So there's only one way things can go, conditioned on the past being this way and the laws being this way. Is causal determinism true? Back in the early modern period, a lot of philosophers and scientists thought, yeah, we have good reasons for thinking the laws of nature are deterministic. Nowadays, almost no one sort of explicitly commits themselves to causal determinism. Physicists themselves are divided, different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So some are deterministic, some are indeterministic. So most philosophers just don't take a stand on this anymore. And so rarely will you see someone identifying as a determinist, or as a hard or soft determinist, as they used to be called in philosophy in like the first half of the 20th century. More often now, people will just say, well, I'm a compatibilist or I'm an incompatibilist, and my view about free will, maybe it depends on whether determinism is true or not, whether it's true or not. If you're a compatibilist nowadays, you probably think we have free will whether determinism is true or whether it isn't. But anyway, the reason why I think the sort of contemporary debate has centered around this question, is free will compatible with determinism or not, is it sort of sorts views on free will into two main camps that think you could have freedom and responsibility even if the world is causally deterministic, whether it actually is or not. And then those who think, no, causal determinism would preclude free will. And so the kind of main positions in the contemporary free will debate are compatibilism. And as Michael indicated, that's not the thesis that determinism is true. So compatibilists used to be called soft determinists because so many of them were determinists who also were compatibilists. But now we wouldn't typically call them determinists. Michael also mentioned there are a lot of kinds of compatibilism. Maybe that's an interesting debate when it comes to interpreting historical views. What sorts of compatibilist views did various figures hold? In the contemporary debate, one of the biggest kind of developments in the last 40 or 50 years is just the proliferation of types of compatibilist views, and different philosophers offering their own kind of nuances. So that's one position. The other I'm going to name three. The other two are both incompatibilist views. One is the view that free will is incompatible with determinism and that we have free will. And then the last view is the view that we don't have free will. So the view that free will is incompatible with determinism and that we have free will is called libertarianism. And libertarianism gets used in the political context. This is completely different from that. It also can be misunderstood, even when talking in the context of philosophy about free will. But most philosophers nowadays just mean the two things I said. Libertarianism is just incompatibilism plus at least some people sometimes act freely. So I thought I'd mention that. There are various reasons to prefer a libertarian view over a compatibilist view. There are arguments for incompatibilism, but many people take it as at least a natural starting point that we do have free will, are morally responsible. I'm ultimately a compatibilist, not a libertarian. I think there are some challenges for libertarians too. The sort of historically significant one is the problem of luck, because libertarians think that in order for us to act freely, our actions have to be undetermined, so not causally determined by anything kind of prior to them, at least for directly free actions. And one kind of question is, this is the question that the problem of luck raises, if to be free, your action has to be undetermined, it looks like your acting in that way wasn't guaranteed or settled by anything that came before it, including anything about you, your deliberation, your judgment about what it was best to do. So it looks like you didn't settle what you did, or it looks like you could have done something else very easily. And it looks like whether you chose this or chose that, or whether you ended up doing this or doing that, looks random or not up to you, since it's so much a matter of luck. I ultimately don't think that's a successful objection to libertarianism, but it's one that's historically significant, and maybe some of my fellow contributors here will have something to say about how that comes up in Reformed Orthodoxy too, if it does. The last view I'll just mention very quickly, and then I'll shut up for now. But free will skepticism, as it's sometimes called, is just the view that we don't have free will. Typically, these are, I guess you could be a free will skeptic. Think free will is compatible with determinism, but we just don't have free will in our world or something like that. But most free will skeptics are incompatibilists who also think that libertarianism fails, or there's no good account of or no good reason to think that we have the kind of free will that libertarians think that we have. And usually free will skeptics are they're sort of motivated by objections to compatibilism, objections to libertarianism, and so it's like the last view on offer, and they end up going there. I said that's the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, but I actually lied, because there was one other thing that I think might be helpful for our discussion, and that's what I take to be one of the biggest distinctions from contemporary philosophy that is helpful in reading back into history what views free will people have had. And that's the distinction between leeway views of free will and sourcehood views of free will. So on one way of thinking about free will, and this is closely related to what Michael called the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP, free will is about having alternative possibilities, being able to do otherwise than what you actually do. You could think of it as like walking through a garden of forking paths. You could go this way, you could go this way. It's up to you which path you go down. On another conception of free will is really about being the source, the proper source of your action. So it's yours, and that's what makes it up to you, under your control. And maybe it doesn't matter whether you had alternative possibilities, whether you had leeway. And one of the reasons for thinking that maybe it doesn't matter whether you have alternative possibilities is what's come to be known as Frankfurt cases, or Frankfurt style cases, where thanks to Harry Frankfurt, they get named Frankfurt cases, but they predated him. At least some versions of them predated his article from the 1960s. But the idea is, like, it seems like there can be cases where an agent lacks alternative possibilities and yet is responsible for what they do. So maybe they don't have free will in one sense, they can't do otherwise than what they actually do, but they're the proper source of their behavior and they seem accountable for what they do. And I'm really motivated by Frankfurt cases and by kind of reflecting on whether alternatives play a grounding role in responsibility, to think that it is sourcehood that matters, and that makes my job as a compatibilist a little easier, because it does seem like determinism would take away alternative possibilities. So yeah, that's where I'll end my spiel for now.
Cool. Thanks, Taylor. That was great. At least for the parts that I was here and I didn't have to run out. Because if you've noticed, it's not lightning that's happening in my room. It's my 2-year-old turning off the light and turning it back on. So I apologize for that. So I'll let Marco take the floor and close us out here before we have some discussion back and forth.
Excuse me. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everybody, and my fellow scholars for their contributions. Just a note, my internet is a bit grumpy here. So if I disappear from the screen, Jordan, I trust you. I don't know, launch a commercial or something.
You know, I'll just pretend that I'm you, and I'll do my best. So,
all right, thanks. Well, thanks for having me, Jordan. First of all, and there is my friends have done an excellent job in briefly but clearly introducing the issue and the issues related, in my view. What I would like to do is to add something that mostly helps when it comes to understanding the historical figures, not just Edwards, that is my author, but in general, any, I will say, historical figure. And this is something which is very often, almost always absent from contemporary analytic philosophy, and which is maybe normal, maybe symptomatic just of the approach, but usually, many times, most of the times, for what I can see, when we ask the question of freedom, what is freedom? What is free will? The definitions are, to use very creatively Kant distinction. The definition are analytic and not synthetic. What do I mean with that? The definitions are formal. They don't have a content, an ethical, practical content. And I give an example here. This is from God and Freedom by Vincent and Kittle, that maybe Tyler knows. I think he wrote an article with one of them. And this is one example, but it's basically the standard approach to defining this concept. I quote, in contemporary philosophy, free will is often defined as the control required to be morally responsible. Here, control is to be understood as control over our decisions, actions, and some of their consequences. This definition is functionalist, in as much as it identifies free will by the role it plays. Throughout this element, we combine this definition of free will with the substantive idea that free will consists in having a choice about something. And then they explain why they go on. Now you can see that this and many other way of defining is basically it doesn't have an ethical connotation. Free, yes, to do, but to do what? I mean, what is the right thing to do? And this is called in some of the scholarship the normative content of freedom. And there are some examples in contemporary analytic philosophy. Jesse Kuenoven, I don't want to butcher his name, but he wrote an article in this book edited by Tim Payne-Spick, and it's called The Problem of God's Immutable Freedom, where it says and claims, I quote, although the second proposal made in this essay is that although a non-volitionist conception of divine responsibility is the best way to make sense of God's praiseworthiness for the perfections of the immanent Trinity, we need to go farther in order to understand the excellence of divine freedom. He mentions divine freedoms here, but then he also touches on human freedom later on. I cannot read everything, of course. A normative conception of freedom is helpful in understanding what significant Christian thinkers had in mind when they call God free. In spite of their differences, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and Luther, among others, and I add Jonathan Edwards, shared a way of thinking about freedom that has fallen out of favor in the modern period, but that is worth retrieving. So this is important, in my view, to understand many. When we talk about freedom, it often becomes a matter only of the logical problem of freedom, and often the teleological or ethical content of freedom is forgot. Now, why have I made this rambling about normative freedom? Well, because in my view, it is important not only for authors like Augustine, Aquinas, but also for Edwards. One of the main objections that Jonathan Edwards, gives to his opponents is this. His opponents, Isaac Watts and Whitby and others, claim that in order to be truly free and truly morally responsible and virtuous, you need to be equally you need to be at the, so to speak, you have to have the kind of freedom of indifference that would allow you to choose also the wrong option, to even sin. Now, according to this definition, God, who cannot sin by an absolute necessity, God is light and there is no darkness in him, is not free. Now, this is the argument. I'm summarizing it intensely, but this is a general argument. And Edwards dedicates in his freedom of the will, he dedicates 2 entire chapters arguing why we need, for a genuine view of freedom, we also need to consider freedom to do what? As Anselm said, there is nothing freer than a right will. And sometimes this is even intuitive for some people. I think of C.S. Lewis, for example, who a great mind, but not necessarily a free will scholar. He ends is surprised by joy with, I'm quoting, I'm paraphrasing, by something like, being a slave of God is the true freedom. Because, intuitively, he understands that, yeah, free, but free to do what? Free from what? And freedom to do and freedom to be responsible is not the end of the discussion. So, and then there is another, John, let me know if I am talking too much. Then there is another issue, I think, and that is important, especially for the historical figures that we want to understand. Edwards, Tuetin, everybody really. It's the larger context. So Edwards' theology and philosophy, they're a real cathedral where everything is interconnected. Now, often the analysis of Jonathan Edwards, but also others, fail to deal with that. Now, granted, it's difficult, simply not just for the amount of material he wrote, but also for the way he wrote it. But in order to have a better understanding of Jonathan Edwards and how and why he says the things he says about freedom of the will, things like his view of causation, his phenomenalistic idealism or modified view of it, they need to be taken into consideration. And the good Mark Hamilton, together with Layne, here present, do a great job in an article titled Confessionalism and Causation in Jonathan Edwards. They tied together all these issues. In contemporary analytic philosophy, sometimes it's very possible to do that, to take just the issue of freedom and necessity and to dissect it and to discuss it, and that's good. Nothing I said is a criticism of analytic philosophy as such, but historical figures like this, though they were analytical in their thinking, in their mind, they are not analytical in their approach. When they mention a concept, they have 39 other concepts at the back of their head. So this is important in my view. I met just today, actually, I met Richard Mueller, Professor Mueller, and I concluded with this little story. We were discussing, Edwards and even some contemporary theology, Van Til and things like that. And he says, the fact is that I am a diehard Aristotelian. And initially I laughed at that. But then when I was driving home, I think that is the general context that explains why, to me, in my personal view, Professor Mueller does not properly understand Edwards on some things, because there is something behind the reading and the analytical analysis of his writing. There is a antipathy academically speaking, with the approach. Being someone who is a quote diehard Aristotelian is not gonna be very happy with reading someone like Jonathan Edwards, especially on freedom. And he will probably end up thinking that he's a hard determinist. But in my view, if we read Edwards and we read everybody else in the context of their general thinking, and again, this works well, especially with the big minds like Edwards, Aquinas, Augustine. I think at least a better understanding, not necessarily an agreement, but at least a better understanding can be reached of why Edwards sounds so dissimilar, but at the same time is also so similar to his Reformed forefathers. I think that's all I have to say for now.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. So now I'm going to flip it here and let everybody just have opportunity to discuss amongst each other. I think there was some excellent material that we could discuss. And those who are watching, you're welcome to continue chatting questions as you think of them as we discuss. I don't know how we want to lead this off. If we want to talk about the last comment on Aristotelianism, and if that can potentially cloud judgment on different people. If we want to talk more, just, Michael, you led off talking about Reformed Orthodox are soft determinists and they're compatibilists in this way. Is that a proper way to think about it? And we can go any direction that we want. So I imagine Michael and Layne, you were the first two to talk. So you're the farthest removed from saying anything. So I'll put the ball in your court if you guys want to lead off with anything.
Well, yeah, let's just hear about what Marco's conversation with Richard Mueller. That sounds cool. Well, maybe what we can do is we can talk a little bit, because I think this touches on what Marco was saying about Aristotelianism and not understanding Edwards if you're really coming from that kind of perspective. The issue of anachronism, right? Because I think one of the things that Mueller makes a lot of I don't mean disrespect when I say this, but a lot of hay about is that using terms like compatibilism, determinism, libertarianism, whatever, drawn from contemporary analytic philosophy, to apply that to the Reformed Orthodox is anachronistic. So it might be helpful at least for me to say this, and then we can apply it to Aristotelianism. But the idea that I think is mistaken here is that just because the term compatibilism or determinism or libertarianism is not used in the 16th or 17th century, it doesn't mean that those concepts are not present. And that's why I structured my opening statement the way that I did. I tried to draw out that hypothetical necessity and free choice were both taught by the Reformed Orthodox and both compatible, right? And that's just the concept of compatibilism, right? So whether or not the word was used, the concept was clearly there. And I think the same thing happens with Edwards also in translating him into Aristotle, and Marco can talk more about this, and Layne probably could too as well, better than I could. But maybe some of the problem that Muller has is in thinking, being too quick to pull the trigger on anachronism. What do you men think?
Anyone's free to jump in there.
Yes.
Yeah, I will. I think so. I think that's true. And I wanted to have like a detente with analytic philosophers and analytic theologians who use historical materials, in saying that, like, I think it's possible to do this well. You just have to get two things clear. One is like the interpretation step, and then like the judgment step. So in the chapter that chapters that I'm writing on Edwards, I try to do a very clear job of like just presenting Edwards's view as he would have understood it in the terms that he would have, and then have a very clearly distinct section where I say, if you like this theory of the good, then you will like this part of Edwards. If you want a thinner theory of the good, then this is not going to be for you. And trying to make the judgments, the normative judgments, the evaluative judgments about the argument, a separate thing, because it could be that I agree with Muller on the interpretation, but disagree with on the value judgment, or vice versa. I disagree on the interpretation, but agree on, that you need Muller's version of contingency to secure moral stability or something to that effect. So interpretation is one step, and then evaluation just has to stay clear and distinct.
One of the things that I've tried to do, and in my book, I don't make this as clear, but in a paper that hopefully will come out eventually, I try to make clear is to make a distinction between what you can call exegetical conclusions about the Reformed Orthodox and philosophical interpretations of those exegetical conclusions. And I would agree, I think I'm agreeing with what Layne is saying here, that Muller's like, you can't argue with him on his exegetical conclusions on the Reformed Orthodox. I mean, well, you probably could if you were, a little bit sharper than I am. But what you can dispute, and I think pretty easily, are his philosophical interpretations of those exegetical conclusions. And it sounds kind of like, I hope, Layne, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of like what you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I jump in with one thing here? So, I don't know enough about Mueller's work and about whether he's quick to say that using contemporary terms is anachronistic. But I will say, because there are because the sort of the conceptual tools are more robust in the contemporary literature, it is sometimes it's almost like the categories are too fine-grained to very easily apply to, especially even farther back. I'm thinking, like, I read more on Augustine, and I'm interested in Thomas Aquinas. There's good debate about what kind of view these philosopher theologians had, and it's kind of hard to know where they land in the contemporary debate. I would be wary to say that because of that, it's like anachronistic for me to say, here's my case for thinking Augustine was a source compatibilist like me. I wouldn't think that, but I would say, here's a reason to be careful. Just sort of putting someone in a particular camp using the contemporary terms is, well, it might not have been that Augustine or someone else sort of saw themselves as choosing among the various views that are on offer today. And I do think that's a complication kind of looking back at history.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and I think another thing that's worth saying is there are a number of very historically informed philosophers that do not hesitate to apply these terms to Augustine or Aquinas or Anselm. I mean, you have like Eleanor Stump, and Aquinas, you have Jesse, and I'll pronounce his name wrong, I'm sure, Kuenhaven, Catherine Rogers as well, and for her work on Anselm, and even her work on Augustine. I mean, they're applying these terms, freely to these historical figures, and it's not like they're historically ignorant. They're very fine historical and philosophical scholars.
Could I parry one of the things Marco was saying to Taylor, just like as a pretty big outsider to the analytic philosophy literature, and Taylor being a master of that. So Marco, one of the things I took that you bringing up is that the way analytic philosophy adjudicates theories of freedom doesn't start with like the metaphysics of the good. Like, is the good something that orders us? And you use the term teleological. And that seems right. Robert Adams's finite infinite goods does do that. It's, very Neoplatonic, comes on the heels of his Leibniz book, but it's like the exception rather than the norm. And so the question I was going to pose from that to Taylor, and Marco, you can jump in before I guess Taylor answers it to clean up any mess I made. Is something like, is that actually the case? Are there compatibilists and libertarians who are thinking, hey, because a lot of the like the what's it called, thought experiment, the Frankfurt style counterexamples, a lot of these are like events based rather than like character, like over a long period of time based. So I just wanted to hear whether and to what degree people are doing that. But before Taylor, I guess Marco had something.
Yeah, I will. I'm just gonna say that I will leave Taylor answer that. Is certainly much more qualified than me to speak for the analytic tradition. Just a small little qualification. I said for what I've read. I've read quite a lot of it, of analytic philosophy, and that seems to be very often the case that the focus, often the exclusive focus, is on the logical problem of free will. Then there are exceptions, of course. I mentioned one, Jesse Kaunhaven or Kainhaven. Sorry, Jesse, we've been probably butchering his name, but anyway. Yeah, so I let Tyler speak for that.
I've always said Cohenhoven, and now I think I must have been wrong all along. So who knows? Sorry, Jesse. One of the things that was hard for me in grad school, trying to figure out the lay of the land in the contemporary analytic free will debate, is that on the one hand, there are people that are interested in free will, think Peter Van Inwagen writing an essay on free will and all his articles and whatnot. And that people like him that are very clearly interested in sort of logical puzzles, in the metaphysics of free will. And there, a lot of that literature kind of develops independently of anything teleological or with a conception of the good or anything like that. At least as I read a lot of that literature, it's more about, if the laws of nature are like this, what does that mean for us as agents and for our capacities or our dispositions, things that seem like completely metaphysical and not sort of in the world of value theory. Then on the other hand, and this is partly, I think, due to P.F. Strawson's very influential paper, Freedom and Resentment, and then there are a lot of other influences on this sort of strand of the free will literature, but there's a lot of people who aren't interested in what Peter Van Inwagen are doing at all in the metaphysics of free will, and are really just interested in like what it is to be a morally responsible agent. What can we learn about our agency from the way that we do in fact interact with each other, how we hold each other responsible, and that sort of thing. And like Strawson himself famously thought that like once you start to see what it is to be like morally responsible and to hold other people responsible, like this whole worry about determinism actually it's kind of misguided. It should go away. Like if we found out determinism was true, we'd still treat each other in the same way. We'd still be responsible, he thinks. Now, I'm too much of a metaphysician. I'm not really a metaphysician, but to the extent that I'm a metaphysician, I don't like that way of thinking about what it is to have free will, what it is to be morally responsible. But I think because Strawson's paper was so influential and so many people are coming at questions of especially moral responsibility, often they don't use the lingo of free will and control, but they're talking in those same kind of circles. They tend to have something like, teleology or conception of the good in mind. And so it could be that like it depends on who you're reading. And it's sometimes hard to see how these two areas of the contemporary debate interact with each other, or why they don't when they should be interacting with each other. The only person who's really coming to mind is someone who says to understand freedom, we really have to have an understanding of like the right and the good. The only person who comes to mind is Susan Wolf in her book from 1990, Freedom Within Reason. She develops a compatibilist account of free will, but one that's it's sort of like a leeway view when it comes to bad stuff that we could be blameworthy for, but then leeway doesn't matter when it comes to doing the right or doing the good. And on that kind of view, you might have something like, I don't know, something on the way to responding to that puzzle about divine freedom, because, in God's case, he's perfectly free, even though he can't sin. And that's consistent with, at least if I'm understanding Wolf's view correctly, that's consistent with her way of thinking about things. So that might be one case of someone trying to do those things together, but agreed. It is strange, especially when you read on the metaphysics of free will, how divorced that is from the good.
Thanks, Taylor. Any follow-ups to that or other questions? And as a reminder, everybody who's in the chat, you're welcome to drop questions in, and I can share them as they come along. I guess one question is, how do we pronounce Jesse's last name? I should know. I've talked to him before, and he's told me how to pronounce it, and yet I still don't remember. I am the world's worst person at remembering how to pronounce people's names. Thoughts, questions? So I mean, I'm surprised there's been. It seems like we've got more agreement here than I had imagined. I know we're more of a discussion here, but I'm just a little surprised. I'm like, oh, see, we're cool using these terms, and they can, as long as we're careful with how we use them, it seems that we can carefully apply them to historical figures. Though obviously there can be debate about whether that's the correct term to use for them or not. But it seems like that is a fairly agreed upon consensus thus far. So I have a question here from Colton. Do you think there is luck at the time of conversion? That's interesting. I don't think I've ever thought about that. So I don't know if anybody else has.
It sounds like a question for Tyler.
Maybe. I was going to say maybe Michael would have more to say about this one. I guess I mentioned the problem of luck for libertarianism. Yeah. So there's
not to answer.
Yeah. I guess really quickly, I just think you might think it's really important that a person's conversion be a free choice of theirs. I'm not sure I think that's necessary, but you might think that's really important. And you might think for a person's conversion to be a free choice, you might think, well, they've got to have alternative possibilities. It can't be settled by anything advanced, whether by the laws or by God's decree. That could lead someone to a non-reformed view very quickly, I think. And maybe that's the motivation for rejecting a reformed view. So that's my initial thought on that. But if you're not thinking of that kind of alternative possibility at the time of conversion as crucial or necessary, then I'm not sure why you would need it.
Yeah. I do want to get to, so Josh put in a question here that I think is interesting. I know Taylor, we had a conversation with Matthews recently
Oh,
on Matthews' Grant proposal, who he argues for libertarianism from classical theism, the doctrine of divine simplicity. And here's the second part of the question: in the mode of divine action, and thus that God can cause all things without determining, in the sense of determinism, all things. Is that compatible with Reformed thought? I think that's an interesting question.
That is a good question.
As a general rule, go ahead, Michael.
No, I was just, everyone's saying it's a good question, so I would just chime in and saying it's good, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead, Layne.
No, I was just going to say, I've changed my rule of thumb, which is if it works for Scotus and Aquinas, it probably worked for some Reformed theologians somewhere in the early modern period. This gets back a little bit to the comments I made earlier, that these aren't like, we could talk more about it, but it's not the arguments of Reformed theology or Reformed accounts of free choice that make it make universal determining providence or whatever it might be view objectionable. It's being theses. So divine simplicity, like this is just something that's going to be common shop. You might have differences when it comes out to conversion, but I don't see any reason why, insofar as Grant's proposal is for, general causation. You may have quibbles on his soteriological account, but insofar as it's classical theism, it's classical for a reason.
Yeah, I guess the challenge for me anyway, the way I think of it is, it'd be great if you could work out a view like Grant's that allows for the kind of providential control that he thinks he gets with the account, and you this really robust kind of free will. But I think there are challenges to the way he develops the view. I think Marco referenced Simon earlier. Simon Kettle has a response to Grant's work that I think it sort of probes in the details. And so it might just be that, it's like you're trying to get the best of both worlds. It might not work. I would think that's where the problem is, not necessarily with reconciling what he's after with reform, with at least some reformers' thought. But I could be wrong about that.
It might be helpful to point out that Oliver Crisp's recent iteration of libertarian Calvinism is making use of Grant's work and kind of trying to, if I remember correctly, I'm going off the top of my head, instead of adopting a leeway view of libertarianism, is adopting more of a source view of libertarianism and using his work to kind of make the argument that there might be room for that within Reformed theology. And if I remember correctly, I think that the denial is that something like God's decree is a sufficient condition for everything that happens. And it seems to me that a denial of God's decree being this sufficient condition of whatsoever comes to pass would be contrary to confessional Reformed theology. So in that sense, I don't think Grant's proposal could be compatible with a confessional Reformed perspective.
If Marco and Layne don't have anything to add to that, I would be curious. Edwards has been mentioned a couple of times, to think about him a little bit. I am not an Edwards scholar, but it seems to me that there's a lot of like sort of lobs that get thrown his way, where he's like mechanical almost determinism that comes across. Is that fair to charge Edwards with that sort of like he's out of step almost with the like broader Reformed tradition when it comes to free choice and things related to it?
So the very first thing that needs to be said is that virtually all scholars admit that there are differences between Jonathan Edwards and the approach, the general approach of the Reformed scholastics. The question is, to what degree and in what way? Now, Jonathan Edwards read Scholastic. He read Turretin. He read Van Maastricht. He loved Van Maastricht. And a few others. Whether he was an expert in scholasticism is debatable, but he at least read a few solid Reformed scholastic, and he read them well. But Jonathan Edwards found himself in a place and in an era where philosophical terminology started to change, where the things like substances and even secondary causes, understood in a certain way, they were started to be questioned, or at least reformulated. So what Edwards wants to do, what he's planning to do, is to consider all these challenges coming from non-Christian, both secular non-Christian philosophy and philosophy that he considered erroneous or even heretical, and use those tools, conceptual tools and ideas and even terms, so to formulate in that new language, so to speak, Reformed theology. Now, in doing that, Edwards did apply some changes to what were some of the main tenets, philosophical tenets of the Reformed scholastics: causation, the theory of concursus, between how that plays out, and free will. Now, from that, to me, in my view, to conclude that there is a radical departure between Edwards and the Reformed scholastic, to me, that's a jump. There are differences. Sometimes, at least for some tastes, it can be considered radical. But to my view, to my knowledge nowadays, to this point of the scholarship, I have not seen convincing argument why Jonathan Edwards could not have subscribed, at least in a loose sense, to the Westminster Confession of Faith, as he himself admitted, and has his friend Erskine himself allowed. So there are differences, yes. There are departures. Well, yes, but it means depends on what you mean with that. I think Prof. Mueller claimed that Edwards is basically a hard determinist and a necessitarian in the bad sense of the word. It just doesn't stand. The reading of what Edwards says. Does Edwards allow for things like multiple potencies that Mueller claims are necessary in order to have genuine freedom and contingency of events and actions? Not in the way Prof. Mueller will like he does, but no arguments, to my view, has been shown that the way Edwards formulates the freedom of the will and a contingency of the will, even though he did not like the term, that's admitted. The way he formulates those concepts, to me, so far, no arguments has been made that those formulations lead him to hard determinism. In spite of his, or some philosopher will say, thanks to his phenomenalistic idealism, and in spite of, or some philosopher will say, thanks to his occasionalism, Jonathan Edwards is able to give a general picture of Reformed theology, which uses different concepts and different approaches, but presenting the same theological substance using a different philosophical framework, which he believed was more appealing to his contemporaries, and of course it was more appealing to himself too, otherwise he would have not used it.
Layne, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, really quickly, Marco should plug his paper. It was a good paper. And so that's the first thing. I enjoyed it. I think it's a very good argument versus account and freedom of will having a fine-grained account of necessity. So if we note the original claim of Muller in 2011 was Edwards is a necessitarian. And if you're a necessitarian, historically speaking, you argue like Spinoza in the sense of like trying to show that modal transfer like just collapses everything into divine simplicity, into one true substance, and so on and so forth. Your people who are not necessitarians typically don't come in and say, here's like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different kinds of necessity, and here's how they're different. That's usually a backstop against modal transfer arguments. So on that point, I think Marco's got a lot to say, and it's high quality paper. The second thing to say is on this point, what Muller is pointing to and establishing as continuity. I just want to scale this out real quick. So Marco points out that, you know, when Muller says genuine contingency, this is like a normative statement, right? Because it's like, if you don't have genuine contingency, which Muller defines as potencies to multiple effects, then, you know, you're off the reservation. There's discontinuity now because you don't have the same account of freedom. If we scale that out, that means everyone who ceases to be Aristotelian in metaphysics and physics is in discontinuity with the Reformed tradition, because a necessary component of having an adequate account of free choice requires you to speak synchronic contingency, multiple potencies, multiple effects, which means like old Princeton goes, all the English common sense realists go. That was the thing I was getting at earlier on when I said, you know, there are many ways of doing Reformed and free choice, and I don't know why the marker of plausibility is being drawn here, other than Muller, you know, liking Aristotelian accounts, and I like them as well, but I don't like them enough to say this is it's a bad thing for Edwards to not have been an Aristotelian circa 1754. The third thing to say is like a meta level comment that we don't have to like go into in great detail, but the question is like, why Edwards? Why now? Why this conclusion? I think if you go back and you read Introduction to Reformed Thought on Freedom, the motivation for both the translation of that book and really, I think, for the Utrecht school and to a lesser extent Muller, although it's obviously, I'm not speculating about motives, but I am speculating on presentation, introduction, and declension narratives. So if you read the introduction to RTF, who are the fall guys? Like, where does the declension narrative get going? It's Aristotle. Aquinas is the bad guy. Scotus is the good guy. Just comes in and saves the Reformed tradition. This is not a declension narrative shared by many people outside of the Utrecht school. I mean, Roman Catholics have their own, and each tribe arguably has, you know, their golden age and the declension narrative. But it's not like this is hardly an agreed upon standard tale of contingency and necessity. And so I think what happened was, maybe, perhaps, speculating, as the RTF narrative became a little bit less plausible, it becomes convenient to look for someone to say, like, here's where they really mucked up Reformed theology, and here's where Reformed theology gets a bad rap and gets a bad name. Now, I agree Reformed theology gets a bad rap and a bad name. I actually don't think it's for any intellectual argumentation. I think it tends to be more social reasons, sorting out over history. So that's my sort of 30,000 foot view I got from the Utrecht school, studying Scotus, advocating for Scotus, advocating for a scotistic ascension narrative, and how we're now at, like, Edwards is the bad guy.
Jordan, can I chime in here a little
Yeah,
bit?
go ahead.
So this is great what Layne is saying here, this whole declension narrative, because Richard Muller does an outstanding job in his book Divine Choice and Human Choice of just blowing that narrative up. I mean, he points to numerous places in Aquinas, even in Augustine, that talks about contingency, in a way that defies that narrative. The other thing that I was going to say is it goes back to the whole issue of anachronism. Muller wants to make the argument that Edwards didn't have any place for multiple potencies and therefore for contingency. But I'm going to suggest that the reason why he thinks that is because he's looking for it in the wrong spot. Just because Edwards doesn't use the language of multiple potencies doesn't mean he doesn't teach the concept. And you find that concept taught in Edwards in his notion of natural ability. His notion of natural ability provides the same exact, well, maybe not the same exact, but a similar, substantially similar notion of multiple potencies. So you can go to various places in the Freedom of the Will where he talks about how there is this ability to do this or to do that. And he's not using Aristotelian language, but he is affirming the concept. And I think because, respect to Muller, he's a little bit too quick to pull the trigger on anachronism. He kind of doesn't see that in Muller, in Edwards.
In interest, so there's been like 10 questions over here on the chat that I could mention. I think this one's a little bit interesting, just given the context of this is free choice and Reformed theology. This one's from Josh. Oh wait, did that? He put another question in already. Okay, is this? Oh no, this is the right question. So the confessions, do they presuppose or require a specific philosophy? The Reformed confessions in particular. Is this, and maybe it's related particularly to the free choice. You can expand it beyond that if you want, but I think that's somewhat interesting here, just for the discussion that's been had. If you want to affirm a Reformed confession, do you have to have a certain account of free choice, or more broadly, a specific philosophy?
Well, the writers of the confession, namely those that would fall into the Reformed Orthodox tradition, were considered philosophically eclectic, right? I mean, they made use of Aristotelian concepts and things like that. But I mean, Muller makes this point brilliantly where he talks about they really were philosophically eclectic, which would seem to imply that there's no one philosophical school that you would have to hold to.
Go ahead, Marco.
It really also depends on what confession we are talking about. I mean, if I consider the confession of the church I attend, there are the three forms of unity: the Heidelberg Catechism and Canons of Dort, and the Basic Confession of Faith. I see no problem. There are no real problem in being an idealist, a phenomenalistic idealist like Jonathan Edwards, and subscribe being in good faith to that confession. There might be some questions when the Canons of Dort talk about means, but even then, Edwards does not reject the concept of means as such. He simply voids means on any independent power, and he stipulates God's intimate presence everywhere, including the means, in the same way as in everything else. And so, although he's not a fan of it's not necessarily a fan of the word means, and even less cause, he has a place for the classical, Reformed saying according to which God ordains the ends and the means, and we are not supposed to divide what God has in His goodwill united. That is, make use of the means and not elevate our mind in trying to figure out things and investigate God's mind and that kind of things. So that, to conclude that, I don't personally, at least in the light of the three forms of unity, I don't think there is a problem.
Layne, I know you had a question for Taylor, so why don't you put that out there?
Yes, I drove home from Texas back to Colorado and spent a good deal of that time consuming season 1 of the Free Will Show. So make sure you subscribe and give a 5-star rating to Taylor. But the question I came up with this is sort of it's a question about what does what becomes a topic or issue of debate in analytic philosophy and theology, and what doesn't. So I listened to the episode on divine foreknowledge and freedom in Occam. I get that Occam's ideas about accidental necessity, the past is fixed in a way that's not up to us anymore, and does this provide an analogy for the future, and so on and so forth. So it's not a question about the content of that debate as much as so that got me interested in Occam. I picked up some stuff and started reading further along in Occam, and so 3 or 4 distinctions later, he gets to his theory of predestination, and he gets to his theory about whether there is any reason in the elect, whether there is any reason in the reprobate. And his account there, with the exception of he seems to carve out room for some sort of foreseen free will, I imagine would be severely sympathetic, that would not receive a warm reception amongst Christian libertarians today. I could point to other passages and other places in Augustine and Aquinas where God's causal contribution is a necessary condition for every single action at all points in time. So divine universal causality, that kind of stuff, causal concurrence and all that stuff. This tends to get not as much play. And I'm just curious as to is it strategic? Is it just people just didn't know the rest of Occam, or they're not aware? And then the other example that sort of gets baked into this is the role of Scripture. So you have an essay that was really good on election and divine and human agency, where you lead off with here are all the givens in Scripture, where it seems something about God's plan for us is not up to us, and in any sort of ultimate sense. Whereas with a lot of the divine foreknowledge stuff, I think there's a sense in which the divine foreknowledge is a lesser problem. The divine decree is an even bigger and harder problem. Divine causality is a much harder problem. So just a question of what do you have any sense of why what gets put on the docket and the itinerary, and what doesn't?
That's a good question. I think in the case of Occam in particular, you get this article, I think it's from 1965 by Nelson Pike, kind of articulating the puzzle of freedom and foreknowledge in a way that's very friendly to analytic philosophy. Lots of analytic philosophers read it and want to kind of explore it. Pike, interestingly, not a theist, sort of raises this as a sort of potential consistency problem for theists of certain types, but just interested in the puzzle. And then you have people I think it was probably Marilyn Adams to first use that distinction from Occam between soft and hard facts about the past to respond to Pike. But you have people interested in tackling this puzzle as articulated by this analytic philosopher, and maybe using something from some historical figure when it's helpful. If that's the way that, I'd have to go back and read Marilyn Adams' paper it's probably from the 60s as well, or early 70s. She herself, medieval scholar, not someone who's going to be ignorant of what comes later in Occam, but maybe not as keen on accepting everything else from Occam, and really just trying to use this distinction, this one place or something like that. I'm guessing, especially in philosophy of religion, I mean, you can see this even in Alvin Plantinga's use of Molina, Occam, and others, not really an interest in doing kind of historical scholarship or looking at a figure's total views, but really just seeing if something that they, a distinction here or there, an argument that they made here or there can be helpful for some contemporary problem. I think that's probably why it looks the way it does. From your perspective, Layne, that's my guess.
Yeah, just to clarify, you're helping me clarify the question, which was I'm not asking analytic philosophers to be historians and to find all parts of Occam or all parts of Molina interesting, but I guess I am a little bit disappointed, and maybe this is just the infamy of Reformed theology and Calvinism outstrips the actual reading of the primary sources. Like, there's interesting stuff in Edwards that doesn't relate to predestination,
right? But
in many respects, like, I don't feel like I ever get to talk about it, or I don't get to write about it, because primarily the first thing I got to do with people is be like, hey, there's in a way that is not required for Augustine, Aquinas, Occam, Molina, despite the fact that their conclusions are as equally unsavory to Christian libertarians as Edwards, not equally, but like it's close enough. So I guess that's the lament, is like, Edwards's theory of subject predicate truth theory. I wish Occam Plantinga had been working on that as well, because I think that stuff's very interesting, but it sort of lies fallow because there's like one thing that Edwards can be known for. So
I wonder if it's the same with, like, say, Calvin and theologians today. I know there are plenty of theologians who are interested in aspects of Calvin that don't relate to predestination, but I've heard from theologians that are friends, like, you have to really, you have to say, like, look, I'm interested in this other aspect of Calvin. Calvin had more to say than just about what he says about predestination. I don't know.
Cool. Well, we're over 90 minutes now, so if there's one more question we want to round up, then we can take that, and we can end it from here. So if you guys have something else you want to bring to each other, or if somebody else in the chat wants to make sure to get something in there, we can do it that way.
Well, since I have Taylor here, I'd like to have a brief discussion about semi-compatibilism. If I understand correctly, you would consider yourself a semi-compatibilist. Maybe be helpful, because I've tried to make the argument that I think the Reformed Orthodox are consistent with semi-compatibilism as well. I mean, could you define it? And then I'm particularly looking for whether or not you think, in any sense, a semi-compatibilist position could be consistent with some sense of an alternative possibilities condition.
Yeah, that's a nice, quick, easy question to answer.
You got 5 minutes.
I know. I feel like I'm probably going to spend another 10 years thinking about that question and writing about it. So semi-compatibilism is a term that my PhD advisor, John Martin Fisher, introduced to describe his view, which his view at least used to be just that we can have the freedom required for moral responsibility, even if... and that's compatible with determinism, even if determinism precludes alternative possibilities. So even if the freedom to do otherwise is incompatible with determinism. So it's like free will is kind of compatible with determinism. One kind of free will is, even if another isn't. And I guess my view's consistent with that, but I would just say I'm convinced that determinism precludes alternative possibilities, and so that's like a slightly stronger view. And I'm also inclined towards a more kind of sourcehood type approach to thinking about freedom and responsibility, where what matters is the actual causal sequence that leads to action, rather than anything to do with alternative possibilities or other ways that things could have gone. Now, the reason why your question is very complicated is because just about every semi-compatibilist, or more broadly source compatibilist theory out there sneaks in some kind of reference to either dispositions or sensitivity to or responsiveness to reasons in alternative sequences or in other possible worlds. And so if any of those kind of modal elements of semi-compatibilist views, resemble a kind of commitment to alternative possibilities or something like an ability to do otherwise, then I think, yeah, then you're right that it's consistent with requiring some kind of alternative possibilities. A friend of mine, Chris Franklin, has a paper from, I think, 2015 in Philosophical Studies. It has this obnoxiously long title, like everyone thinks that an ability to do otherwise is necessary for free will and moral responsibility. But he really, I mean, if you're interested in this question, he does a nice job of showing why, even on a view like John Martin Fisher's, which is this semi-compatibilist view, you might think that you are committed to an ability to do otherwise. I've responded to that paper, and I think I still agree with my response. But like I said, I think this is something that, it might take another 10 years of thinking about. What would it look like to have a source compatibilist view that doesn't have that kind of modal commitment to it? I want that kind of view, I think, which might make me different from my advisor, but it's hard to work it out. Carolina Sartorio is one of my other favorites on this, and she's done more to kind of push the needle in the other direction. So that's another person to read.
So the reason why I ask is to nail down what fits into semi-compatibilism, because it seems to me like the Franklin paper, and then Fisher has a paper also addressing Franklin's paper and some Festschrift for Irwin or something. I can't remember what that was, but and Sartorio kind of pushes it, like you said, a further away. But it seems to me then that makes room for at least two concepts within the category of semi-compatibilism. One where you really don't have any kind of general ability, as your paper says, and another where you kind of do have a leeway kind of alternative possibilities condition. I mean, would you say that that'd be accurate? Like that really the heart of semi-compatibilism is just a denial of a libertarian form of leeway alternative possibilities, or do you think that would not be accurate?
It'd have to go just a little bit further with, or else you risk kind of conflating the semi-compatibilist view with a dispositional compatibilist view like Kadri Vivulins. I mean, that's what Franklin's really interested in kind of pushing, is like, if it's not just the debate between semi-compatibilists and libertarians, it's this debate among compatibilists where some think the ability to do otherwise is required, and some say that no, it isn't, and yet they seem to require almost the same thing for free will.
Yeah, because when Fisher talks about the mechanism, and going to alternative scenarios or other possible worlds to test the mechanism, I mean, I don't know how that's not some kind of alternative possibilities condition. I mean, it's not obviously the same as, a libertarian view, but anyways, I get too sidetracked. Maybe you and I can talk about it another time, but I'm really trying to just get focused on how precisely are we going to define semi-compatibilism?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think you mentioned that if this is the chapter I'm thinking of, that Festschrift chapter where Fisher responds to Franklin, he takes a different line than I would take in response to Franklin, and says, well, I do sort of require the same kind of ability, like alternative possibilities that a view like Vivulins would require, but they play a different role in grounding or explaining responsibility. And I guess that's like yet another way that we could distinguish the views. But yeah, maybe it's too early to tell like how it'll all shake out and what the best way of thinking about alternative possibilities with these different compatibilist views will be.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Marco, you're going to add something?
I wanted to say something else, if that's possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like, if you guys agree, to address the follow-up by Josh Smith, who quotes Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, section 2. And just especially Michael, who is a Presbyterian minister. What do you think?
I could not hear the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, basically, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Basically, Josh Smith asked the question of whether the confessions presuppose and or require a specific philosophy. Mm-hmm. And then he quotes Westminster Confession of Faith 5.2, quote, he orders them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. End of quote. Maybe this is a question for Layne too, since he wrote about Edwards and idealism. In my view, even though, as I said, Edwards might at times might have not been a fan of words like secondary causes and contingency. We are not bound to use the same terms, and even understood within Edwardian framework, or even Malebranchian, if we want. I think one can, in good conscience, ascribe to that section of the Westminster Confession. Then there is the pragmatic question: is, I mean, who is going to ask you what what consistory is going to ask you? You have an Aristotelian idea, phenomenalistic idealist, or a full-blown occasionalist view of causes. And, as long as the articles are maintained in doctrinal life, I don't see any disagreement between the positions. But that's my view. I'm not a Presbyterian, so.
Well, now I'll start asking that question on the floor of Presbytery.
Yes, the Presbyterians don't have enough discussions going on at the moment. So,
well, it seems very on brand.
Okay, so the question is, given the idea that things fall out according to secondary causes, necessarily or contingently, does that phrase commit you to a school of philosophy? Is that what the question is?
I would think so, yeah.
Okay.
If it's meant with Aristotelianism, or even more specifically the way Mueller or others interpret it, to me the answer is no, clearly no. Yeah. Because we have to, when subscription requires a subscription of the words of the confession, not of what the writers of confessions meant or possibly meant.
Right. Well, that would be like part of the issue. Like, I don't know of any presbytery that would require you to subscribe to exactly the words if you can communicate the same idea in different words. And if Edwards' concept of natural ability would be something that can do that, then I think substantially, you wouldn't be denied ordination. I doubt my presbytery would deny that. If I recall correctly, Edwards did subscribe when he was going to be president of Princeton to the Westminster Confession, and I don't know if they required like a full subscription or a system subscription type thing, but maybe Layne would know more about this than I would. But initially, I wouldn't think that it would require you to a specific school of philosophy.
You'll be shocked to hear that there were hardliners who pushed that it did commit to a school, and there were softliners who, the more things change in the Presbyterian world, the more they stay the same.
Well, it's not just the Presbyterian world these days, so it's everywhere. But yeah, this has been a delightful conversation. So I guess one last thing I want to make sure that everybody has a chance before we close up. Give me the best location to go to find, number one, your work, and then maybe tell me what's your favorite essay or book related to free choice or free choice and Reformed theology that you think everybody needs to read. And I'll start with Taylor, and then I'll go to Michael, and then to Layne, and then to Marco.
I have a website which I try to keep mostly up to date with my articles and also like podcast interview things like this. And then Layne mentioned my podcast that I do with my friend Matt Flummer called The Free Will Show, where we mostly just interview other philosophers, talk about stuff in the contemporary free will debate. Favorite thing to read, I guess my go-to recommended reading for just like an introduction to the contemporary free will debate is blanking on the title now. Free Will: The Basics by Megan Griffith. So that's what I would recommend.
So I guess I'm next. Is that right? Okay. Well, I have a Facebook page. That's probably the best way to reach me right now. And I always say, if you friend me and you don't look like an axe murderer, I will definitely accept your friend request. In terms of the best book to read, obviously it's this one, right? A Reformed View of Freedom by me. No, but a lot of the things we talked about today will be addressed in here. I kind of like Michael McKenna and Dirk Pereboom's Rutledge Introduction to Free Will. I think that's a really good book. And also even Robert Kane's Oxford Introduction to Free Will. I think those are really good places to start. So if you're interested in the analytic philosophy literature, I would begin there.
If I could jump right back in to echo that about the McKenna and Pereboom book, it's like denser than the book I'm recommending and significantly longer page count. But what I really loved about that book was the history of the free will debate from like the period of the 60s up to like the 90s, the big shifts that have happened. It's really well done.
Layne?
Yeah. I think last time, I'll stick with what I did last time, which was like a gradation. So I'm big on the primary sources. So if you can get your hands on Lombard, book 1, book 2, great. Figure out how the precedent was set up. If not, William Ames's Marrow of Theology is literally just sentences, and you can read it in an afternoon. All the issues of free will and the decrees. Turretin's the next step up after that. It's a little bit more technical, and it's a shame in some respects we don't have many analytic theologians who are like Turretinians or whatever, however you would put it, because there's a lot. While he gives you, there's probably not a theologian that I know of or have on my shelf who gives you more distinctions per page than Turretin does, and the distinctions need to be unpacked, and they usually need to be unpacked against the background of Francisco Suarez and the rest of the tradition. So that's the stuff I love. Ames, Turretin, and then for contemporary stuff, I haven't been able to read for leisure as much, but the stuff that I always benefit because he's a great writer, but also a great thinker, is Sam Newlands' papers, which are all available at his website. You just Google his name. He's a co-supervisor. They're out from behind a paywall, and several of them are like early modern battles of the Titans, Spinoza versus Leibniz on metaphysics, Malebranche on the problem of evil. So if you think free will, or if you think being reformed on the problem of evil is hard, wait till you become an occasionalist. And Sam does his best to sort of steelman Malebranche's account there. So lots of fun stuff there for contemporary readers.
Well,
Thanks.
Layne, can I jump in here really quickly? You're talking about not being Turretinian. It might interest you, and I'd love to collaborate with you on this. I'm actually working on a book on Turretin and free will and free choice in the analytic tradition right now. So hopefully that'll come out, and everybody on this podcast, I would love to just kind of run stuff by you just for
See, this is an instance, Taylor, this is an instance of backward causation.
I do think that that's possible, but I'm an outlier, I think.
All right, Marco.
Well, you can easily find me on academia, and also on Facebook. There are, especially in the United States, there are not very many people with my name, so it should be pretty easy. And I also have a blog. It's called Philosophy of the Cross. But anyway, regarding books, well, I suggest this. This is the very first book by Edwards that I read. And I remember reading it the first time. I was 25. Didn't understand very much, but then I read it the second time, and it became surprisingly clear. So it's a very engaging, very. It's not an easy read, but it's very rewarding, and I really suggest it. And then, so this is when it comes to one suggestion of primary sources. Regarding secondary sources, Michael's book is very good. I like it. I really like that. and also Mueller. I disagree with some conclusions and some things that Mueller says, but from an historical point of view, even disagreeing with some of his conclusions, Mueller is phenomenal. Probably there is nobody or very few like him. His knowledge of the primary sources is scary almost. And then so Mueller, and then his friends Paul Helm, Reforming Free Will. And I think these two books, they dialogue very well. So, and to have a good taste of what is going on in the debate about the Reform Orthodox and discontinuity and continuity. And then for those who have an analytic taste, I've been reading this book. I think I mentioned it already. It is short, but they do, the authors do an awesome job in briefly but clearly summarizing all the contemporary views, which are not always easy. Yeah, for those who are analytically inclined, I suggest that one. And that's it. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I had a lot of fun. I think I learned something, a couple of things, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it too. I'll let you guys mention one last thing if you feel like you need to before we shut it down. Any comments?
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jordan.
Yeah.
Yeah, for having us.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So check out all their work. As you know, they're all publishing, writing, doing stuff, but they're also doing normal person stuff. So I like having those sort of guys on the podcast and everything. So this was a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for tuning in to the only analytic Baptist and confessional podcast on the planet, but today especially Presbyterian. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys soon.